Thanks, Chip. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this exciting session. Before we begin, let's have a brief introduction from all the panelists over here. So I'll begin with myself. My name is Nimit, one of the co-founders at Votes, which is pioneering a new method of voting. And obviously, data and analysis is key to our work. So excited to participate here and learn from the experts, and we also look forward to some great questions from the audience. So I'll hand it over to Hallie. Why don't you begin by giving a brief introduction about yourself?
Perfect. So excited to be with you all today. Hallie Bregman, and I am the CEO and founder of the Bregman Group. I run a consultancy where we use data analytics and technology to help improve employee outcomes. So analytics in the people space, if you will. I have built and scaled teams, analytics teams across the people space, and also worked in marketing and product in the data science world. So excited to be with you all.
Excited to have you here as well. Next, Anik, you want to go next and introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm happy to as soon as I'm off mute. Hi, my name is Anik. Nice to see and meet everybody here again. I'm a VP of People who has sort of scaled a number of different organizations and startups specifically within the kind of Boston, I would say, startup ecosystem over the course of my career. And I have helped build, obviously, data teams from the ground up, helped scale data teams after the initial sort of inception of it, et cetera. So I'm happy to comment as sort of about some of my experiences in the past, having sort of gone through this process. Yeah, hopefully I can add some value to some of the folks thinking about how to manage their data teams.
Awesome. Glad to have you here as well, Anik. And last but not the least, Simon, want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, can do. Happy to be here. I'm Simon Scanchi, VP of Operations and Analytics at LinkSquares in Boston, where we're creating the best darn contract management software there is. Prior, all been in the Boston software space. I've had jobs in operations and scaling analytics functions at companies ranging in size from small 20 employees all the way up to 1,000 employees. And I'm happy to be joining the discussion with you all today.
Thanks, Simon. Great to have you here as well. So so let's dive in. So as you all know, data is key to almost everything we do these days, and particularly in the case of startups, having a solid data foundation, data and analytics team is kind of like the lifeblood. So so let's kind of start with the one of the key questions. So maybe we'll begin with you, Anik. In your sort of expert opinion, what are some of the really important prerequisites in order to build a sound data and analytics team?
Yeah, thanks, Nimit, for the question. And having seen, I would say, some of these, I would say, data teams come together early on versus later on, I will say that some of the prerequisites that I have experienced myself, I would say particularly kind of referring back to my time in the autonomous vehicle space where data was just sort of coming about. It was a really important aspect of it. Given that we're in the startup space, I would say one thing is under the sort of understanding that workforce planning and or kind of job requisitions are sort of as best as they can be put together, understanding how much value you're looking to get out of something. One of the biggest prerequisites that I've noticed is having data to work with. I would say, depending on how you think about using data after the fact, one of the things that you need to have obviously is an understanding of like what general data is available to be able to kind of take to that next level of analysis, etc. Um, that's definitely something that I've noticed has not always been sort of super well defined, especially when making either your first hire or early on committing to making a number of hires within the data analytics space. It's not truly having a grasp of like what it is that you're working with or what you're asking these data analytics people to sort of dive into at a high level. Yeah, I'm happy to defer to Hallie and Simon to get your thoughts on this as well. But given that we're in the startup space, it's not super well defined a lot of the times, and I found that to be one of the biggest challenges, kind of starting a data analytics group.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and add to it, again, that audit stage, right? That understanding of what systems are in place, what data can you get out of systems, and then what are the questions you want to ask that you need the data to answer. So I find a lot of times people hire roles because they're supposed to, and not because they have a really strong business case. Now, we all know there's lots of really strong business cases to have analytics support within your organization, but making sure you really are able to communicate that, understand what systems are at play, what data you can ask folks to work with, that helps with hiring and understanding what skill set you're going to actually need to bring in, and then also with making sure that expectations of the person you bring in are met when they walk through the door and they're not promised, boatloads of data that just don't exist. So,
yeah, and I'm happy to chime in as well. I totally agree with we need enough data to be able to do anything with data, right? And sometimes it's a matter of there being enough data that's representative of the actions that you can do something with. So kind of when I think about the first things that I'm going to do with a data team, it's usually better understand how my customers are using my product, or better understand how to engage with them in my go-to-market motions. And so there are some necessary underpinnings there. Do you have tracking of what's happening in your software product? Do you have a CRM that tracks your go-to-market activities and your marketing activities as well? I kind of see those as prerequisites. If not, you're going to come in and have no data to work with. And so totally agreed there. The second piece that I think I would add is sort of an organizational readiness to use data to drive either business strategy or decision making, right? Because what you'd hate to have happen is have somebody come in and create a bunch of really good results and do a lot of really good analysis, and it just sort of falls on the floor because no one's ready to pick it up and action it. So I think kind of the data capabilities in tandem, or need to grow sort of in tandem with the organization's readiness for actionability there.
That's great. Thanks, Simon, Hallie, and Anik. So, Simon, that kind of leads into the next question nicely. You spoke about the organizational readiness. So, from your experience, where do you feel like the data teams and the analytics team should kind of sit in the overall organizational structure?
Yeah, this is the fun age-old question. Should we centralize or should we decentralize? Is there one data team, or can we all work together, right? And I think there are a few important concepts that sort of underpin my thoughts around this. So one is, we're data people and data doesn't lie. We should be ever striving for accuracy in what we produce, and just some concepts within that. Man, it's so nice to have one data lake. I've been in organizations where you have data warehouses spinning up left and right, and you can't figure out which one has the data that you're looking for, and they're managed by different teams, and you can't get access. I think centralizing gives kind of the ability for that one data lake, shared source of truth approach. Also, in the vein of accuracy, is sort of a unbiasedness when it comes to showing results of what the data tells us, right? If you sit in one business unit, you may have a different lens on what the data tells you than another might. But I find it's often important to just report the results as they are, and then share those around and see what a kind of like unbiased, but also then informed analysis tells you. So striving for accuracy, I think that leans me in the camp of centralization over decentralization of a team. The other thing I think about is just who are data teams and how do they work? Who are the people on them? And I over time, and this is probably clear to me early on, but they think and act a lot more like engineers and product people than they do sales reps or customer success managers. And so, I kind of think of it as, man, you want to sit as close to and follow as much of a agile build approach as you can. But also from a career perspective, you got to make sure that those folks are getting sort of the technical coaching, and that becomes necessary to have technical leaders to help drive that stuff for you, grow your career. But the big gotcha is then if you try to move that team under product, all of a sudden they're kind of getting in the way of customer features. And so I kind of fall short of saying the team should be siloed under product. I kind of think it's a place in its own right. Being an operations leader myself, I think I have some bias, but I think somewhere within the operations or sometimes even finance from an accuracy perspective and company reporting cadence is a good place for a business analytics function to sit. Sometimes though we differentiate and we say, hey, the product you're building actually also has an analytics component to it. And so actually at LinkSquares today, we sort of have two analytics teams. We have a data science team that sits underneath our product group and is building and enhancing features for the product team and for our customers. And then we have a more business analytics function that I'm leading. It's interesting how those two teams work together, and I think they have a great symbiotic relationships, sharing the same tech stack, but serving different masters at the end of the day. So, in summary, I kind of think that centralized approach with key tentacles, if I'm an octopus or something, out into the organization to drive actionability of data in partnership with other operations groups that serve their respective business unit masters becomes a really good method and organizational structure to follow.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah.
So,
if I can piggyback. So I think you raised a really good point when it comes to centralization with regard to the tech stack, right? I think that is the thing we probably all would agree should be centralized and standardized, and that folks are working from kind of that same piece. When it comes to actually team an organizational structure, I think about it a little bit differently. And really my answer is it depends, right? Which is not a sexy answer because, hey, I'm not giving you the answer to a question, but I do think it depends within a framework. So when you're small, real small, I think it makes a lot of sense for analytics folks to sit within the team they're working with. So Simon, you mentioned like product analytics versus marketing analytics versus business analytics. Those are all different profiles of analytics. And typically there are teams that each of those folks might be embedded with. So somebody who's focusing on marketing analytics makes a lot more sense early on when they're an analytics team of 1 or 2 to sit within marketing, be, tightly embedded in that organization. As the analytics representation grows across all of the different domains, that's when I think it makes sense to bring everybody together. And I actually would ultimately then separate them out again, but first bring them together, right? I think you have a nice core of analytics expertise that are all working on different domains, but are able to share tools and knowledge. And I think that ability to partner and brainstorm, oh, hey, I'm implementing this machine learning model. What are you doing? Oh, I have an application for that on the product side that I never thought of, but you're doing it in marketing. That sparks a good idea. And so I think that kind of, symbiotic energy really comes from all sitting together as a unit. When an organization gets so big, and I'm thinking really now we're past hypergrowth, we're starting to become a large organization. Many of you are not there yet, but as you kind of aspire towards this, I actually think there is a place where you separate teams back out, and you embed them back within the organizations that they support. Organizationally, you can either like call it they're sitting with marketing and they're physically sitting with marketing, or they're actually part of the engineering group, but they really are sitting with marketing. Their day-to-day is with the marketing team. The benefit of having them as part of an engineering group often comes down to permissions, right? And security structures and tool access. And so one of the things I've experienced is being restricted by not sitting in engineering in terms of access to dev machines and particular, administrative rights, for instance. And so I think that is a reason why keeping analytics, in that engineering bucket can be beneficial. So lots of contingencies there, but certainly lots of things to consider.
Thanks, Hallie. So Anik, do you want to chime in? Are you in the centralized camp as well, or do you have a different perspective on that?
Yeah, it's actually thanks, and thanks, Hallie and Simon. I think both very interesting perspectives. I like the story arc that you presented, Hallie, in terms of let's start off with sort of decentralization, centralized, then decentralized again. Having worked at sort of the smaller size teams, I've seen how decentralization is very effective. I would say on the back end, having worked at sort of 100,000 person globally distributed company, I've also seen how a matrix structure actually makes the most sense in that respect, in terms of having a functional leader kind of present the, hey, I'm leading the data sort of team and I'm going to provide the expertise and management for you in a functional level. And then sort of splitting that out into accountability to the actual, I would say, the stakeholders that you're working with on a daily basis, whether it's marketing, whether it's, some service level group within the product team, et cetera. I think that in itself, it makes a ton of sense. I would say one more gotcha is that when you look at data, it's interesting, looking at analysts versus engineers. And I think, Simon, you hinted at this earlier, folks tend to operate more like engineers. I would actually say that the scope and the language that we're using there is business intelligence tends to skew a little bit more towards analysis and a little bit more towards like spreadsheet wrangling, if you will. And I would say that the engineering side of it, skews a little bit more towards like database management, database, establishing, working with actual data lakes and ETL tools, et cetera. Like combining the two is actually a more difficult task. And I would say I would pose that as actually a bigger challenge within this element of centralization versus decentralization. How do you actually create some synergies between the different, I would say, technical proficiencies that are dealing with this data? That's an interesting challenge to have to navigate. And again, it depends on the organization, depends on the tooling. The biggest gotcha that I've seen on a very practical level, and I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit in it, but one of the pitfalls I've seen in regards to this is having a decentralized team oftentimes, unfortunately, leads to having different conclusions come out with the same data set, or just not having the right data set to draw the right conclusions at that point in time. And I think that's a wasteful effort, right? So if you don't centralize early on enough, you might be missing out on some synergies you can draw from the different data teams that are working on these issues and problems.
Thank you. Yeah, those are great insights. So I think that kind of leads us nicely into the next part. Simon, you briefly touched upon some of the qualities and capabilities you look for in terms of when you are potentially hiring data or analytics resources. Could you dive in a little bit deeper on that, and perhaps also share some stories, some good, bad, ugly things from your experience? It would be useful for the audience.
Yeah, I think, I mean, first, thank you for the question. But so first off, I'll say, man, I've been lucky on the hiring front. I have gotten to work with and hire and learn from a lot of amazing, talented people over time. I feel like each person brings something different to the table that you're not expecting, and tests you as a leader and helps the team grow, in different ways. None of it, right or wrong. But some of the things I'm thinking about, sort of when I'm evaluating analyst candidates, and I think some of this is, to Hallie's point, circumstantial based on the size and the needs of the organization. So I'm going to generalize a little bit here. But from a soft skills perspective, anyone in data that I'm talking to, and actually anyone I'm hiring in general, I'm looking for some innate curiosity. I think that innate curiosity, though, in data is especially important for analytics roles. Like, just asking questions about the data. What does the data tell you? What are some of the things you find in the data? I'm interested to learn more. I spend my weekends, figuring out some new Python packages that I didn't know anything about, previously. And I think that curiosity leads to just an initiative taking sort of mentality and a desire to do the work and excitement at the end of the day. And typically folks who are doing that also have a pretty high EQ. The other soft thing I'm sort of evaluating is just the ability to collaborate with other teams and within the team. I think when you're starting out in a data org, or even your first hire, you need someone who can be the jack of all trades, who can manage the projects and the stakeholder communication, who can, figure out ETL tools, who can wire everything together and get all the integrations going, as well as produce some actionable results, and then maybe even present them. And so, like, the gamut of capabilities there is very wide and broad. But I think core to it is the ability to collaborate with peers and bridge those gaps that likely exist when you're starting out any new function in an organization. From a hard skills perspective, I mean, this stuff is the easy part, right? It's the stuff that if you're getting into a career in one of these areas, you just know is core to the capability set. But just to sort of rattle it off, right? There are different functional focus areas, and I think we've enumerated some of them, right? If you're a data engineer, you got to know about ETL tools, you got to know about source system integration type stuff, you got to know about the tools at your avail in the GCP and AWS tech stacks. And, I really only think about cloud because it's the wave of the future. But, maybe there are some other things that are a little bit more on-prem that folks should know about as well. From a data science perspective, core to data wrangling is Python, R, MATLAB, as well as a bunch of functional knowledge in what data analysis and data engineers are doing, how to clean the data and process it appropriately. And then more on the data analyst side, knowing about a variety of BI tools. And SQL is the language of our people. So got to know that, right? So there's there's this component to the hard skills that is really just, can you use the tools that are going to be necessary to do your job? It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have worked with the exact tech stack that you're joining the company to use. A lot of the skill set I find is pretty transferable. Looker is pretty similar to Tableau. You can use one and figure out the other sort of along the way. The other thing I'm kind of looking for is, I think, like I said, especially if it's earlier and you're not looking to specialize as a data engineer, data scientist, data analyst, you're rather looking for maybe a data analyst that can be a jack of all trades as maybe an initial hire. You kind of want that breadth of, they've done a little bit of all of those things. They may not be super deep in any area, but just the ability to cover the gamut is a really valuable skill set. There's a guy on my team today, and he has that, he's done a little bit of all of it. And I'm very jealous of him for having that innate ability. And I think it's what helps you get from 0 to 1 very effectively, and not create gaps in what you're building, and think about doing things for scale rather than just a game of whack-a-mole answering the questions as they come. And then the last thing about hard skills is just like taking a scientific approach in how you do your work. I think it's really important, especially on the data front. But yeah, and again, just to really highlight it early on, looking for folks who can dip their toes into each of those areas.
Thanks, Simon. So, Anik, given your experience with people management and generally culture management, any interesting stories you can share which might be insightful for the audience? Good, bad, ugly type of lessons.
I'm happy to try and distill some of these down. But to comment on what sort of Simon was saying in terms of evaluating skills, I actually think a very nuanced component of this is leveling your person, and again, evaluating against like where this person fits in. Are they senior? Are they junior? Are they, a director type? Like where do they fit in within the sort of analytical army that you're assembling? I think it's a difficult question to answer per se. Let me actually back up for a second and comment a little bit on the type of profile that I think makes sense to kind of have initially versus kind of, again, down the road. Very clearly, initially, early on, to Simon's comments, you probably want a generalist, somebody that can do a little bit of everything, somebody that can actually get something up and standing and running so that you have something to, basically work from in terms of your data analytics stack. You want somebody with enough engineering chops to be able to do something. You want somebody who has the analysis chops to be able to kind of produce some actual insights from it. But I think as you progress within your journey, it's really important to think about, how do we get these things to add capacity? How do we get these things to be more efficient and ultimately specialized down the road, right? You don't want to have an army of generalists, not in all circumstances, not in most circumstances. Maybe in some circumstances you do, depends on the organization. But I will say that over time, you probably want to kind of specialize in having data engineers, having one senior data engineer, and maybe a few kind of mid-level engineers, and then maybe one junior engineer, right? So balancing the team as you scale it up is a key component of how I would certainly consider hiring and or building the team. You don't want just a pure layer data scientist. They might never actually get anything done per se, not to stereotype too much, but they might be too caught up in theory to actually get down into the engineering chops of it. So just some lessons to kind of learn from this is hire generalists to start, get something stood up, eventually invest in specializing as you kind of grow and scale out your team. And again, consider the leveling of these individuals. Where are they coming in? Are they coming out of a boot camp? Are they, experienced with, 10, 15 years of experience having done this? And where do they slot in? I think those are some key questions to ask yourself as you're sort of building this army. I hope I answered that question a little bit.
Oh, that's great. So Hallie, next question is for you, and I'm sure many of us have heard this this comment made in passing or sometimes in not so kind ways, that the overall goal of data teams is is to do good, is to make your organizational decision making process better, and obviously that has additional benefits. But there is a fair amount of criticism which a lot of data teams receive, both internally and sometimes very publicly, externally as well, that they aren't doing as well as they could. And a lot of that is sort of attributed to teams not being set up for success, which ultimately leads to lack of trust or trust getting undermined, and it kind of makes the whole situation a lot worse. So given your experience, what would you kind of suggest people? How should you conceptually look at your your data team? Should it be like a product? Should it be like a you know sort of a service, or core engineering, or sort of a mixed match of all of that? So I'd love to hear your insights on that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that Simon and Anik didn't mention before that I think is kind of part of this story is storytelling, right? I think a really good analyst can tell a really amazing story. And I think that ultimately is how you increase effectiveness of your data team, right? We talk a lot about the technical skills and the ETL pipelines and the data lake, and certainly those are all important. And there are fairly easy ways to assess them. Go by hacker rank or something like that to test coding skills, right? But the ability to actually assess problem solving and storytelling, those are some of the most important pieces to kind of understanding whether you should operate as a product or a service, right? And so I think about the service-oriented data structure where you literally are working with stakeholders day in and day out. Right, you are essentially not owning your tools or your product, right? You are often responding to somebody else in the organization who has a question, and you are helping them suss out the answer. And so your job is not just to do the analytics to help figure out the answer, but then to go back to that stakeholder who very well could be an operational leader or a marketing lead, like folks who are not necessarily data savvy or as data savvy as you are, and be able to convey that information back. So that is a different skill set and a very intentional decision than if you're building data as a product, right? I think in those situations, right, you still have a set of stakeholders and you're still kind of working with the business, but you're, much more embedded in how the tools you build will scale and effectively be used perhaps throughout the organization, democratizing the data, if you will. And so really different strategic decision, and again, not a one size fits all answer, but intentionally thinking about what kind of product you're building and whether you need a product oriented data team or both, right? There's sometimes use cases where you actually need data as a service and data as a product, and can set that up. So.
I love the part about the storytelling. I think that is such an important thing. Thanks for that. Yeah. So Simon and Anik, you want to chime in on that part as well, the criticism sometimes data teams receive, and how to kind of handle that, and the data as a product versus the data as a service question that often comes up?
Yeah, I'll make mine quick. And Simon, I'd love to actually hear from you, having sort of run these data teams before. I'm curious to see how you've set them up for success. But something that I think as part of Hallie's comment, storytelling, in my mind, incorporates describing ROI. So essentially, as part of the storytelling, showing and basically making a case for this is where I'm delivering on value that was otherwise not realized yet. So, I think ROI and being able to flush out ROI will set up the team for success in a lot of ways. And I think somebody who can tell a story and incorporate this concept of ROI into it, I think that'll sort of break the mold if you're sort of stuck in a rut.
Yeah, I love this one. And Hallie, I think you covered it well. The typical pitfall is to stand up a data team, create the best tech stack ever, and have a bunch of data coming out of it and say, our job's done. Like, look, all the data's there. What do you mean you guys aren't using it? Figure out the answers to your questions. And so, like, how do you avoid that pitfall? I think is sort of the key question. I've taken on like, sort of different flavors, organizationally circumstantial, in the best way to do that. I find that there's an operating cadence that every organization has, and regular reporting of key KPIs and metrics that occurs. The more your team can be embedded in the creation process of those regular table stakes deliverables, the more you're just part of the data conversation. And what that opens you up to is inevitably when a leader has a question of why did that metric change month over month, and you can provide a really good service in answering that question, it creates a flywheel effect where they keep coming back to you. And it's sort of, it doesn't just magically happen, I think is an important takeaway. Creating the alignment, proving value iteratively, establishing the appropriate baselines, and then kind of like iterating as the relationships and the capabilities grow, is where this where that becomes, it results in something most effective, and where folks start to look at the data team as a amazing resource and ally, more so than a cost center that does weird things that nobody understands.
Thank you. So next, this one for your way, Hallie, as well. Sort of based on your experience, what are some of the key things, startups, people are just getting going, should focus on in terms of building a data-driven culture in the organization? It's a kind of, it seems very core and fundamental in many scenarios. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. I think data literacy is one of those things that's very hard to measure, but incredibly important to understand. And so we talk about this a lot in the people analytics space, because I work primarily in a space where data has not been part of the ecosystem and the language for decades and decades. It's probably been about 5 years that chief people officers are thinking about metrics at all. And so a lot of the folks I work with are frankly not highly data literate, right? I think this is pretty different from when I worked in marketing and product, which are fields that have worked with data much longer. And I'll tell a story here. Within an organization I was at, I spent time in both the marketing product organizations and the people organization. And in marketing and product, right, data literacy was high. We had the tools, we had our SQL servers, we were, coding in Python and putting things in production. It was great. And same organization, I moved over to the people team. and everybody was making pivot tables in Excel. And if you all know, right, if you've ever started an analytics team, like you kind of start with Excel, that's right. But like, I was like, wait, there's all these sophisticated tools, right, for scale, for automation, reusable scripts, right? Like we're doing great stuff. Why does this team, like, why hasn't that been adopted in this team? Well, forget adopted. This team didn't even know those tools existed. Same organization didn't even know the right people to go ask to say, hey, can we get that too? Or what should we even get, right? What should we even be building as our tech stack? And the people analytics tech stack tends to be pretty different in terms of security requirements and those kinds of things than more general business data. But I think it was such an illuminating experience to just show how even within a single organization, data literacy can vary. And so making sure that you are understanding the requirements from your stakeholders, understanding who your stakeholders are, right? So you're not delivering this to the data scientist sitting next to you, you're delivering it to the chief people officer, the VP of operations, the head of legal, whatever, whoever it is, right? And what is their level of literacy? And I think that really informs the complexity of the kinds of analyses that you do. And again, returns to that storytelling component. Nobody needs really fancy, neural networks. Nobody needs to understand how those work. They can work really, really well. They can do great things for recommendation engines and other things, right? But your stakeholders don't care. They just want an answer. They just want to know, what does it do and how will it help my customer or my team? And so thinking about those pieces when it comes to creating kind of a sophistication in your analytics mindset and language, certainly important.
That's great. Anik, would you like to chime in a little bit on the data-driven culture aspect?
Yeah, I actually think that something that Hallie said that sort of sparked my own interest is this concept of analytics not really being prevalent within the people and or the talent space is very clearly felt by myself. And I actually wanted to provide a piece of advice for anybody who's maybe in the people side or kind of adjacent to it and wondering, where do I start? I've found that introducing analytics to the talent acquisition process as sort of the starting point is one of the easiest places to start. It's definitely, you get to measure very quantitatively like how your recruiting process is running, how efficient it is, and those are one of the easiest jumping in points. And I think a key benefit is some of the modern applicant tracking systems, ATSs, or even beyond that, some of the sourcing tools are already kind of equipped with a lot of the kind of analytics that you'd be expecting to see. So it makes it that much easier and that much sort of, I would say just easier to adopt as a sort of a starting point. But yeah, I think echoing what Hallie has already said, I think advice, anybody within the people and or the talent space, start with talent acquisition as a place to sort of introduce analytics and run with it from there.
That's great. Thank you. So we have a few questions from some of the attendees. But before we get in, just one last thing I wanted to throw it out there, and maybe Simon, you can address it since you touched upon this briefly earlier about when to sort of build the so-called modern data stack. Is it right off the block before you even hire anybody, or you wait for your first generalist hire to come in and then start doing it, or let that person do it? I'd love to kind of hear your insights on what's that right time and how people can sort of learn on how to build that or choosing a modern data stack.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, so this is something that takes a lot of requirement gathering to make sure that you're going to pick the right solution. Anytime you're going to choose a tech stack, you want to at least have something that's going to work for you for 3 years. I just don't want to spend a ton of my team's time rebuilding stacks and rebuilding stacks. I want to get a stack in place that's going to solve my team's needs on a multi-year horizon, and will maybe we won't utilize all the functionality out of the gate, but we will surely, grow into. So a couple of components there to think about that I would do, I guess, to your point, jointly with the first hire. Reason being, they're going to be using it. So I would love their input and are likely a subject matter expert anyways. We recently made some systems decisions, and I love the bouncing ideas back and forth with somebody else who talks the same talk, as opposed to making a decision in a vacuum, right? So surely wait until you have somebody in place. But I also use the recruiting process to tease out from them what good ideas are and start to evaluate those. The questions and requirements I think you need to gather are like, sort of, what are the source systems you're working with? What's your upstream data? How big is it? Some systems are more compatible with ETL tools than others. How clean is the data, and how much pre-processing is it going to need before you can use it? What's the update frequency? Am I going to need real-time data to be able to make my decisions, or will refresh once a day work? And then I think there's also, as you get farther down the stack, how will my stakeholders interact with this data? And then last but not least, and the key component, how much budget do you have to work with, right? So you take all those inputs, and then you just pull up Gartner and you say, what are the best tools? And sometimes you spend a bunch of unnecessary time diving into the tools that aren't even on the Gartner matrix, and you say, why would I even consider one of those tools anyways? It was, we are a startup, and so we want to support other startups as well, but you realize there's some missing functionality inevitably that's going to get in the way of you doing the job you want to do. So stay at the top of Gartner, focus on what are the tools you already have in place, and take advantage of native integrations between tools as much as possible. And then be aware, that there are a lot of features and functions of some of these more advanced systems that you may not use out of the gate. And that's great. Don't go simple, stupid to start, and then layer on top as the needs warrant. So I think, in short, it's make sure you have the appropriate requirements so that you're not building something that will become staleware in a 6-month time horizon, or shelfware, and kind of like, really understand what the business's requirements are, so that you end up meeting those with the selections you make.
Great. Thank you.
One of the things that, I would quickly add that your data tech stack is not just your data tools, right? It is also all of the other tools in your organization. And so having a framework to help evaluate vendors when considering other tools that support particular processes, and understanding, again, how those play with your data tech stack and ecosystem. Again, what kind of data can you get out from the system? Is it answering the questions you'd want to answer? Or are there pieces of information that are missing or unsupported that are really important, that means you should probably pass on to a different vendor? So one thing worth calling out, because I think it's something people often don't consider when selecting a vendor, is kind of the data integration component. So
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for those insights. So let's dive into some of the audience questions. So Anik, maybe you can address this one. This is a question from Maureen Mansfield. The question is, please address the role of the Chief Data Science Officer and what impact this has on the overall company.
It's a very interesting question. So let me actually start by saying that I think the role of Chief Data Science Officer has been a traditionally existing role in a lot of organizations. I actually want to say what I've noticed happen over time is a lot of CIOs have been charged with kind of this data component as part of their organizations, especially within larger organizations. I think that in itself has been an interesting shift to kind of consider. If you do happen to have a chief data science officer, somebody who is literally charged with data science as their kind of predominant domain, I think one of the biggest things that your company probably has is data as a product, and I think there's some product implication to it. So having that person really focus on integrating with the product team and delivering on how data science or the data analytics as part of that entire product suite kind of works. That is something that this person can do to maximize the impact within the company, within their organization. Again, it's not a common role that I've seen, especially from my experience. Again, having worked in these various areas, I think CIOs are much more common. I think data science in itself, if you have one of these, data as a product is probably one of the things you're doing. So yeah, those are some of my insights. Again, I'm happy to hear from others as well. If anybody has any insights there.
Thanks, Anik. Ali or Simon, do you want to chime in a little bit there?
Yeah, I can echo Anik's point, right? The CIO and how data has often rolled up underneath them is also what I've seen. There is a growing role for the CDO specifically. I've yet to hear of chief data science officer though specifically. I think the thing I would say is the coming forward of a CDO role means data has a seat at the table and is at the forefront of conversations at the C-suite, right? And so I think it's recognition that just as important as business process and tools, data is a product to be focused on in its own right. And so I love the kind of creation and focus and additional attention that organizations that have these roles end up getting. And I think it actually sends us leaps forward in thinking about data security and like policies around following, all the best practices as opposed to just getting the job done. I think that's what you get when you have sort of a seasoned leader in a seat like that. Yeah, just some rough thoughts from me.
Thank you. We have another question from Anne Rosen, and perhaps Hallie, you may have addressed this earlier as well, so maybe just briefly reiterate. Where do you view as the right department for the analytics and the business intel as the company evolves, and how vertically integrated should this function be?
Yeah, I think, to reiterate a bit of what I shared before, I think the right department is dependent on the size of the business. But ultimately, I do believe there is a period of time when a centralized data organization normally sits within the engineering organization. I've seen it sit outside. I prefer when it sits within. Is pretty useful model. But then as, again, the company scales, I think going back to that decentralized model, there's really micro teams, right, embedded within each of kind of the stakeholder groups. That really matrixed model is incredibly beneficial.
Got it. Thank you. There's another question. This one is sort of more sort of follow up on the first one. I think it's a question from Inderes. Question is, any tactical advice for a first data science hire in terms of setting up the stack and the processes for the org that will scale well? So, Simon, you had probably touched upon that in detail. Maybe you want to re-stress that piece, the first hire.
in terms of setting up the stack and processes for the org that will scale well, I guess I would say, yeah, just pick the tried and tested tools, right? You know, maybe what's worked for you before won't work in the future, but go around and talk to some peers in the industry and see what selections they're making. Troll the heck out of Reddit and Twitter, and you know, there are very vibrant communities where you can learn from others' mistakes and not make those. I know I had a lot of sleepless nights when I was using Amazon Redshift. And it wasn't until Snowflake came along that I could breathe a sigh of relief. And so when I came to Link Squares, there was just no question in my mind that I was going to use Snowflake as a data warehouse. Surely there are others that have come quite a long ways. But I just know that one's going to give me those sleepless nights. And so I kind of think you want to apply a little bit of a lens of what am I trying to achieve, but also like, what is just going to work for me? And I think, you know, that's from the data stack perspective. And then from the, you know, how do I fit the first role in the organization? I guess there's just a component of understanding your org and what are the needs of the teams that you're going to be working with and who are your stakeholders. Find your partners early and nurture those relationships, and they'll pay you back in spades. Whether they're, you know, engineers who you're going to be pulling data from, or they are downstream data consumers who have questions that you can help them answer. And sort of, you know, establishing yourself early can go a long way.
One thing to add there, don't think your organization is so special that you need to build tools in-house, right? There's lots of organizations, right? And so you're the first one coming in to lay the groundwork, and your executive team's going to come to you and say, well, we need it to do this very special thing that only we can do. We're a special butterfly. It's not true. Everybody thinks that way. You use the tools out there. They're excellent.
Excellent, excellent advice. Thank you, Simon, Hallie, and Anik. I think we're down to the last few seconds of the session. So just wanted to thank you, each one of you, for your excellent advice and insights, and thank you to the audience for attending and for some great questions as well. So over to you, Chip. Thank you all.